all started with a simple email. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. It was just another message in my inbox, one more subject among the pile of emails I usually receive on a daily basis. However, something in the title caught my attention: The Twilight Breeze, my story. I opened the mail with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. The sender was someone unknown, someone who signed simply as Emma. The body of the message was brief, almost cryptic. "Hello. I don't know if this will reach anyone who can help, but I need to tell my story. The place I'm talking about is real, and the events I describe happened just as I tell them. Please read this carefully. Perhaps you can understand the gravity of what happened. Thank you for your time. Emma." I was driving my old car along the winding road that led to the nursing home The Twilight Breeze. The sun was setting behind the horizon, tinting the sky an ominous reddish color. As I approached, the building appeared in the distance, a dark and menacing silhouette against the twilight. When I finally reached the main entrance, I felt a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. I had accepted the job in hopes of finding a quiet place where I could spend my time caring for the elderly, but there was something about the Twilight Breeze that made me uneasy. The facade of the building, with its moss-covered gray stone and narrow windows, seemed to watch me with suspicion. I took a deep breath and got out of the car, heading for the front door. Before I could knock, the door slowly opened, revealing Mrs. Jones, the director of the nursing home. She was a tall, thin woman, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and dark eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. "Welcome, Emma," Mrs. Jones said in a gruff voice. "I hope you find your stay here interesting." I smiled nervously and nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Jones. I'm excited to get started." The director gestured for me to enter, and together we walked through the long, dark corridors of the old people's home. The walls were decorated with antique portraits and somber landscapes, adding to the feeling of being trapped in another era. I couldn't help but notice the stares of the residents as we passed. There was something unsettling in their eyes, a mixture of fear and despair that put me on alert. Mrs. Jones led me to my room, a small room on the first floor, furnished simply but cozily. "This will be your room," said the director. "Dinner is served at 7 o'clock. I suggest you don't be late." I nodded again and Mrs. Jones left, closing the door behind her. I began to unpack my things, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had been with me since my arrival. I told myself that I just needed time to adjust. Shortly before 7 o'clock, I made my way to the dining room. It was a large, lightly lit room with a long table in the center. The residents were already seated, whispering among themselves. I took a seat next to an elderly woman with white hair and a friendly smile. "Hi, I'm Emma," I said, trying to break the ice. "I'm Katie," the old woman replied. "You are the new nurse, right?" I nodded. "Yes, I just arrived today." "What's it like living here?" Katie looked around and lowered her voice. "It's a quiet place, most of the time. But some nights, things aren't so quiet." I frowned, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Katie was about to answer when Mrs. Jones entered the dining room, silencing everyone with her presence. "It's time for dinner," she announced. "Please enjoy your meal." Dinner passed in tense silence. I couldn't help but feel that there was something hidden beneath the surface, something the residents dared not mention in the presence of the director. After dinner, I returned to my room, still thinking about Katie's words. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard whispers coming from the hallway. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the whispers grew louder. I opened the door to my room and looked down the hallway, where I saw a shadow glide quickly. With my heart pounding, I decided to follow the figure. The shadow led me to the room of Mr. Johnson, a man in his 80s known for telling horror stories to the other residents. I knocked gently on the door before entering. "Mr. Johnson?" I called softly. The old man looked at me with glassy eyes, clearly disturbed. "They come for us," he whispered. "Every night, when the clock strikes midnight, they come." I tried to calm him, reassuring him that everything was fine. But I couldn't help but feel a growing uneasiness. That night, as I went to bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Johnson's words. My first day at the Twilight Breeze had been anything but what I expected, and a sense of dread came over me as I finally closed my eyes. The silence of the night was broken by a piercing scream. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. Without thinking, I ran out of my room, following the sound of the scream. What I found in Mrs. Taylor's room would change my life forever. The old woman lay dead in her bed, her face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The horror of what I saw made me recoil, my mind trying to process the scene before my eyes. Night had fallen over the Twilight Breeze, and with it, a dark shadow that threatened to consume us all. The discovery of Mrs. Taylor's lifeless body shook me deeply. The expression of sheer terror on the old woman's face kept haunting me. Although Mrs. Jones tried to reassure everyone that it had been a natural death, I could not help thinking that there was something darker behind it. The next day, the atmosphere at the Twilight Breeze was tense. The residents were quieter than usual, and their gazes were elusive. I decided to find out more about what had happened the night before. After breakfast, I approached Katie, the old woman I had met at dinner. "Katie, can I talk to you for a moment?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Katie nodded and led me to a secluded corner of the main room. "What happened last night? Why was Mrs. Taylor so scared?" Katie looked around before answering. "This place has secrets, Emma. Things most of us would rather forget. It's not the first time someone has died like this. There's something in this nursing home, something we can't see, but it's there, lurking in the dark." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What kind of things?" I insisted. "Whispers in the night, shadows that move when they should not. And those who see them don't usually live long after that." That night, I decided to stay up to see if I could discover anything else. I sat on my bed with a book, but I couldn't concentrate on reading. My mind kept going back to Katie's words and Mrs. Taylor's terrified face. As the hours passed, the old people's home fell into a sepulchral silence. Then, shortly after midnight, the whispers began. At first they were soft, almost inaudible, but little by little they increased in volume. I left my room, trying to locate the source. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I walked down the dark corridors, past the rooms of the residents, all apparently asleep. Finally, the whispers led me to Mr. Johnson's room. "Mr. Johnson," I whispered, knocking softly on the door before entering. The old man was sitting on his bed, staring at the wall. "They come for us," he said, his voice trembling. "Every night, at this hour. Those who died here never really left." I walked over and sat down next to him. "What can you tell me about them?" I asked. "I need to know more so I can help." Mr. Johnson looked at me with a mixture of fear and sadness. "They were Dr. Smith's patients many years ago. He experimented on them, trying to trap their souls. Many died here, and their spirits were trapped in this place. They are angry, Emma. And with good reason." I felt a knot in my stomach. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than I had imagined. Suddenly, a loud knock sounded at the door of the room, followed by a louder, clearly audible whisper. "Get out of here!" shouted a female voice, full of desperation. Mr. Johnson and I looked at each other with wide eyes. I slowly got up and opened the door, but there was no one there. Just the empty, dark hallway. I returned to the room, more determined than ever to find out the truth. "Mr. Johnson, do you know anything more about Dr. Smith's experiments?" I asked. The old man nodded. "There is a basement, a part of the old people's home that we are not allowed to go to. It's where he conducted his experiments. No one talks about it, but we all know it's there." I knew I had to explore the basement if I wanted answers. That night, I decided not to sleep and instead plan my foray into the forbidden zone. I made sure to bring a flashlight and a small knife, just in case. The next day, I waited until all the residents were in their rooms and Mrs. Jones was in her office. Then, with my heart pounding, I headed for the basement. The stone stairs were cold under my feet, and the air grew thicker and more humid as I descended. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I found a rusty iron door. With effort, I managed to open it. Inside, the darkness was total. I turned on the flashlight and the beam of light revealed small, damp cells, exactly as Mr. Johnson had described them. I walked through the cells, feeling a tightness in my chest. Finally, in one of the farthest cells, I found an old diary, covered with dust and mold. I picked it up carefully and left the basement as quickly as I could. Back in my room, I began to read the diary. The yellowed pages contained lurid details about Dr. Smith's experiments. His attempts to capture human souls were described with scientific coldness, and the horrors he inflicted on his patients were unimaginable. That night, I could hardly sleep, but one thing was clear: I had to free the souls trapped in the twilight breeze. I had to put an end to the whispers in the dark and the shadow that lurked in the halls of the nursing home. I spent the next day reading Dr. Smith's diary every spare moment I had. It was a disturbing account, full of cruelty and madness. Each page revealed darker details about the experiments he performed on the patients in the old people's home. "The human soul is the essence of life," he had written in one entry. "If I can isolate and capture it, I could achieve immortality." The entries described inhumane procedures, where he used patients as guinea pigs, bringing them to the brink of death in an attempt to trap their souls. As I read on, my revulsion turned to fierce determination. I had to find a way to free the trapped souls and put an end to the curse that seemed to hang over the old age home. That night, as I was preparing for bed, I felt a presence in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a shadowy figure in the corner. My heart raced, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Who are you?" I asked in a whisper. The figure moved into the moonlight streaming through the window, revealing the disfigured face of a young woman. Her empty eyes looked at me with a mixture of despair and hope. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How?" I asked. "Tell me what I can do." The woman raised a trembling hand and pointed to Dr. Smith's diary. "The key is in his words," she said. "Release us." Before I could respond, the figure vanished, leaving a cold feeling in the room. I got up and opened the journal again, frantically searching for any clue that might help me. In one of the last entries, I found what I was looking for. Dr. Smith had mentioned a ritual that he believed could free trapped souls. I needed certain items: a black candle, sea salt, and a personal relic of each of the trapped souls. The next day, I set out to gather the necessary items. I went to the old people's home store and found the candle and salt without much trouble. The personal relic would be more difficult. I decided to talk to the residents, starting with Katie. "Katie, I need your help," I said, taking her to a secluded corner. I explained what I had discovered in the diary and what I needed. "Do you have anything that belonged to the patients who died here?" "Something personal." Katie looked at me with surprise, but nodded. "Yes, we keep some of their belongings in the attic. I don't know if they're all there, but we can look." We went up to the attic, a dusty place full of old boxes. We searched for hours, finally finding objects that belonged to Dr. Smith's patients: a pocket watch, a porcelain doll, a gold ring. Each one of them had a sad story behind it. That night, I prepared the ritual in one of the basement cells. I placed the personal items in a circle, surrounded them with sea salt, and lit the black candle in the center. I began to recite the words of the ritual, my voice trembling but steady. As I went on, I felt a growing presence in the room. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and whispers filled the air. Finally, as I completed the ritual, a strong wind swept through the cell, blowing out the candle and scattering the salt. For a moment, all was silent. Then, one by one, the figures of the patients appeared before me, their faces showing a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," they said in a collective whisper before fading into the darkness. I stood there in the cell, feeling a peace I hadn't experienced since I arrived at the nursing home. I knew there was still much to be done, but I had taken the first step toward freeing the trapped souls and ending Dr. Smith's curse. Despite the initial success of the ritual, I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. The following nights were relatively quiet, but there was a palpable tension in the air. The residents still seemed nervous, and the whispers had not completely disappeared. One night, while reviewing the latest entries in Dr. Smith's diary, I came across something that chilled my blood. There was a mention of a last resort in case his experiments were discovered. Something about a final protection he had put in place to make sure no one could undo his work. That night, I decided to stay up one more time. Shortly after midnight, I heard a sound I hadn't heard before, a dull, steady thud coming from the basement. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously descended the stairs, the knocking sound getting louder as I got closer. When I reached the basement, I saw something that left me paralyzed, A tall, dark figure was pounding on the walls of one of the cells, trying to free himself. His face, though blurred in the gloom, looked vaguely familiar. It was the spirit of Dr. Smith. I backed away slowly, but the spirit turned and looked directly at me. Its eyes were wells of darkness, filled with indescribable anger and hatred. You dared to interfere with my work. I ran for the stairs, feeling the spirit chasing me. I made it to the first floor and slammed the cellar door shut. My heart was pounding, and fear came over me. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I needed help. The next day, I decided to confide in Katie. I told her everything that had happened, including my confrontation with Dr. Smith's spirit. We need outside help, I said. Someone who really understands how to deal with this. Katie nodded, concerned. I know someone. She's a medium who helped my family years ago. I can call her. That afternoon, Katie contacted the medium, a woman named Elizabeth. She arrived at the nursing home at nightfall, a small but imposing figure with a reassuring presence. I explained everything that had happened and what I had discovered in the diary. The spirit of Dr. Smith is protecting his work, said Elizabeth. After listening to me, we need a more powerful ritual to free him and all the souls he keeps trapped here. Elizabeth guided us in the preparation of a new, more complex and dangerous ritual. This time, we would need to directly confront Dr. Smith's spirit and break his connection to this world. That night, we went down to the basement. Isabel lit candles around the cell where she had seen the spirit and began to recite a series of ancient chants. Katie and I stood nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. The air in the cell became icy, and the shadows began to move again. The spirit of Dr. Smith appeared once more, his anger palpable. "You cannot stop me," he shouted, advancing toward Elizabeth. The medium continued with her chanting, her voice firm and determined. Katie and I held our positions, although the fear was almost unbearable. Then, something incredible happened. The souls of the patients she had released earlier appeared in the cell, forming a circle around Dr. Smith's spirit. "It's time for you to go," said Elizabeth, her voice ringing with authority. Dr. Smith's spirit screamed in fury, but could not break through the circle of souls. Slowly, his figure began to fade, and a last cry of despair echoed through the cell before he disappeared completely. Silence fell over the basement, but it was a silence of peace. The souls of the patients smiled before they too faded away, free at last. I took a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief. Elizabeth turned to us, tired but satisfied. "We've done it," she said. "The nursing home is free." Weeks later, I found myself in an old library in the heart of the city. The place was filled with dusty shelves and leather-bound volumes that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The smell of aged paper and faded ink permeated the air, adding an aura of mystery to my search. I spent hours going through old books and archives, searching for any mention of phenomena similar to those I had encountered in the Twilight Breeze. Finally, in a section devoted to the occult and paranormal, I found a book entitled Forbidden Experiments, an Occult History. Its yellowed pages were filled with disturbing accounts of scientists and occultists who had attempted to manipulate human souls. My heart pounded as I read about Dr. Smith and others like him. I discovered that Smith had been just one piece in a complex web of individuals who shared a dark obsession with controlling souls. Each chapter of the book mentioned a name, a place, and a story, each more terrifying than the last. One of the names especially caught my attention, the Haven of Serenity. It was another nursing home, located in a small town to the north. According to the book, there were rumors of unexplained disappearances and strange phenomena similar to those I had experienced in the Twilight Breeze. I put the book in my bag and left the library, feeling a weight on my chest. The magnitude of the challenge ahead of us was overwhelming, but I also felt a new determination. I knew I could not ignore what I had discovered. Not as long as there were trapped souls and cursed places that needed to be freed. I returned to the nursing home and gathered Katie and Elizabeth in the living room. I showed them the book and explained what I had found. "This is bigger than we thought," I said, pointing to the names in the book. "There are other places like the Twilight Breeze. We must investigate and help free the trapped souls." Elizabeth nodded, with a serious expression. "This confirms what I feared. We cannot ignore it. We must prepare for whatever comes." Katie, although visibly worried, showed firm resolve. "I am with you, Emma. We have faced the unimaginable and we have come through. We will not let other souls suffer as they did here." We began planning our next mission, gathering information and resources to meet the new challenge. We knew it would be dangerous, but we were determined to continue. One night, as I was reviewing my notes, I felt a familiar presence in the room. I looked up and, for an instant, thought I saw an ethereal figure by the window. It was the spirit of one of the souls we had released into the Twilight Breeze. His face showed an expression of gratitude before he vanished into thin air. I took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. I knew our mission was important and that we were doing the right thing. The journey had just begun, and although the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, I was ready to face whatever came. With the support of my friends and the strength I had found in myself, I felt I could handle anything. The shadow of the past still lurked, but this time, I was not alone. I had allies and a clear mission to uncover the truth and free all the trapped souls. Emma's story doesn't end here. There are more dark places to discover, more secrets to reveal, and more souls to free. The saga continues and Emma is ready to face whatever comes next.